Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Seed World Strategy webinar. My name is Alex Martin, and I serve as the editor for Seed World, and today I'm more than happy to be your host. Today's theme is Saving Corn from the Drought, where we're going to learn how breeders and tech companies are working to protect their corn crops from extreme weather. And just a reminder, we're going to be live tweeting during today's webinar. So if you'd like to join our conversation, please use the hashtag SW Strategy Webinar to connect with us on Twitter. We'd also like to let you know today's webinar is being recorded. So if you have any technical difficulties or you just want to go back and re-listen later, that recording is going to be made available at seedworld.com following the proceedings. And today, I am so happy to introduce to you two fantastic speakers, Will Kletter, Head of Customer Success at ClimateAi, and Stephen Schwarm, corn breeder at Beck's Hybrids. After Will and Stephen finish speaking, we're going to host a short Q&A. That means if you have a question for either of them, type them into the chat box at any time during the webinar, and we're going to address them during that Q&A session. So make sure you type in your questions so you don't forget them later. And in today's webinar, we're going to talk about a topic that's been growing a lot in discussion, especially this year, extreme weather. If you've looked at the news recently, you've known that in the past few years, and especially in the last decade, we've witnessed years from heavy rainfall, like in 2019, that led to extreme flooding, to drought, like in 2012. It's getting harder and harder to expect what's going to happen in terms of Mother Nature in the fields, but luckily, companies like ClimateAi and Beck's are working to prepare for it. So today we're going to learn how we use data and to predict what weather might be like for a particular year, as well as see how breeders are taking that data into account when working with new genetics. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker of the day. Will is the head of customer success at ClimateAi, where he focuses on ensuring that ClimateAi's customers, seed companies, input providers, agriculture financiers, growers, and other agribusiness segments optimally mitigate their climate change and continue to grow their bottom lines over the coming season, years, and decades. Will is a former principal at the Boston Consulting Group in their agribusiness practice, and he spent 10 years working on climate change and sustainability topics, including environmental consulting, investing, venture capital, startups, and growth strategy. He has an MBA and an MS in natural resources from the University of Michigan. And with that, I don't want to hold the mic anymore. So thank you so much, Will, for joining us. I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you so much, Alex, and thank you all for listening in today. I look forward to, and Stephen for presenting as well. I look forward to the conversation and some of your questions. Before I begin, I'll also just say that my colleague will be posting some more details about ClimateAi in the chat, and also feel free. You'll see my email along the bottom of the slide as well as our website to follow up with any questions. I'm going to spend more time talking about our customers and the problems that we solve. So we wanted to provide these additional resources to learn more about us in case you're interested. So let's start with where are we today? For a long time, the agricultural industry has run on historical averages. And the reason that we've done that is because it has worked. But we are in a new paradigm now. Climate change is very much a now problem. And as you can see sort of from the image on the left, sort of the climate volatility is not just continuing to go up and down, it's fundamentally changing and moving away from that historical average. We're in a new world. And part of that new world, whether it's the topic of drought for this agenda, or the extreme flooding that the Midwest experienced in 2019, as you see on the right, means more extremes, means different temperature conditions for our customers to navigate, and it means a greater challenge to food and food security. And so how do we navigate this new world? I want to introduce one of our customers, Pacific Seeds, or Advanta, the Australian group, and our good friend Barry, who we've had the pleasure to work with for almost 2 years now. Barry talks about he's facing problems in the market today, but fundamentally, from a breeding perspective, a cross or a hybrid that he's making has to be suitable 10 years down the road when it actually is able to go to market. But given the volatility that we've seen in Australia, the massive wildfires at the start of 2020 and sort of persistent drought, how are we to know what that market will look like? It's that question that motivated Barry to come to ClimateAi. And in this presentation, I want to talk more about Barry's story and see how we can use climate information to help inform our product strategy and our breeding strategy. The types of questions, before I get into it, I'll just do a short bit on ClimateAi. Barry's question is one of a number of questions that we help our customers answer. And you can see those questions on the left. Fundamentally, though, we like to simplify it and say, what is going to happen to the areas I produce or the areas I sell to in the future? And what are new areas that I should produce in or sell into in the future? Because climate change is disruptive, but it will also create new suitable climates for our crops. And we need to know what those are so we can move ahead of our competitors. The way that ClimateAi does this is a different approach to forecasting. We have our forecast models look out a few days, weeks, months, years, or in the case of this conversation for breeders, that 10, 20, 30-year time horizon. We use AI and machine learning to make forecasts more accurate, but also a lot more specific. So we don't talk about the average temperature. We talk about the number of days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit in July in the 2030s. So, when might you experience a heat stress during flowering, for example? We combine that with sort of an analytics layer that translates this forecast into actionable insights. So whether that's sort of looking ahead at the growing season to think about planting, or looking far into the future and sort of thinking about the specific traits and exactly how many acres will be affected, will need that trait. We try and always translate the forecast to something that you can use in your business to help our customers reduce uncertainty and maybe even seize some new opportunities. And finally, what I'll say is, this is applicable across the seed value chain. Seed is our first and core segment. We spend a lot of time with seed customers, and we'll focus a lot on breeding today, but we have customers across sort of the whole seed life cycle. All right, let's get back to Barry. So fundamentally, the question that he had, you saw it earlier, is how am I to know what's the market look like for my technology or for my seed technology in the future? What are my customers going to face? And what I need is not just to know that it's getting hotter or that it's getting drier. I need to know very specifically what's the market opportunity, what's the revenue at risk if I don't adapt. So we started with an analysis to say, looking across all of your different end markets, can we create climate zones that are more or less, if you assume, one part of that zone is getting warmer, you can assume the same across. And that allows you to sort of chunk their end market of Australia up into zones. And if we have there's a need for a drought-resistant variety in one zone, we can say how many hectares is that, or how many acres, and then ultimately how many dollars. So taking those zones as our starting point, we then get into very specifically what are the risks that we're evaluating. So it's a lot about heat, it's a lot about drought, growing degree day accumulations, the ability to double crop, whatever question they needed to inform their market strategy. And ultimately their breeding strategy. And by marrying these zones with those traits, we're able to say X number of acres will experience extreme heat. And without a heat tolerant variety, you stand to lose X million dollars of sales. Or with that variety, you could gain X million dollars of sales by being the most prepared for this new market. But we didn't stop there. It's great that we know what the target to shoot for is, let's say somewhere in Australia, New South Wales, or whether it's Illinois, Indiana, wherever. But if that's the market 20 years from now, where can I test today? So our tool will also search the world to say, oh, it's almost like a Google search for climate of what is a place that today looks like Indiana will look like 20 years from now, so that I can cite my trial locations in a place that is representative of what my customers will experience when I actually get to market. And so it's not just about a market strategy. It is an end-to-end seed, breeding, and production strategy. And so the result is that the breeding team knows sort of what are the climate resilient traits and varieties to shoot for. The sales and marketing team has their business case to get the resources, and R&D knows how to cite trials. As you can see on the left, Barry and the Advanta team were part of a profile that included ClimateAi and the Wall Street Journal talking about exactly this use case of how they're using climate data to get ahead of this problem. And while I'm on the topic, I also want to give Barry and his team, Andrew Short and their product marketing department as well. You know, if we go back to sort of all the questions that I raised before, at the end of the day, we have a technology product and it forecasts climate and the impact. But they brought a lot of creativity of how they were going to think about this problem in their business. We can provide the answers, but the answers are only as useful as asking the right questions. And with Advanta, we were able to get to some very good questions, which led to some very good outcomes, and helped set them, and most importantly, their customers up for future success. And they're building on this success by saying, if given that we know what the risks are, we're going to breed for that. We're also going to give tools to our customers today that can help them navigate these risks now. So they have launched a product called Skip, powered by ClimateAi, and working with our weather station partners that go on to ag, to allow farmers to get a forecast tuned to their field that looking at not just days, but across the growing season to help them with key decisions like when should we plant. Advanta has used this tool internally to help figure out when is the right sort of planting season going to begin. How can I be the first to market and sort of time the start of the season? And using that technology last year to predict rainfall and when the season would begin, they got an additional 5 to 10% of sales. And they said, okay, if that's what we're doing, let's see if we can help our customers win as well. There's a lot of other ways customers use this type of technology. You can look, we were working with a malt barley customer to look globally at their entire sourcing portfolio and say, what locations are going to basically be no longer suitable for barley, and how can I replace them in my portfolio so that I can maintain the security of my supply? We're working with vegetable seed producers, deep diving on their production regions to identify what is the risks to their supply chain? How can they secure future revenue by making sure that they will have seed supply 10 years from now? And we're also working with customers to help them, let's say, for example, in the middle, you realize one of your locations is not suitable 10 years from now. We can use that Google for similar climates tool to help identify new locations that are similar to your best producing ones today, so that you can move ahead of the competition, get access to land and water, the best contract growers, and get ahead of that 5-year process that it can take to set up a new production location so that you don't put your supply at risk. And you can see the feedback from the customer there. Is that, this is the best display of what climate change means for my business. And that's really what it's about, because you don't care about, is it getting warmer? You want to know what that means and what you should do. And that's where not just our technology, but our partnership with our customers can help lead to that insight. So the point I'll leave with all of you is, what is the questions that you're going to ask? What is climate change? mean for you? What are you experiencing today that makes you nervous? What keeps you up at night? Whatever those questions are, whether you ask it of ClimateAi, whether you ask it of, of whatever source you might use, these are questions that do need to be asked. And at ClimateAi, we're happy to help you think about what those questions should be and hopefully steer you to some answers as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Will. I really appreciate that conversation, and it's kind of cool to see how data can be applied to climate change and how seed companies can use that to help their grower customers in the future. So with that, we've learned a little bit more about the data side. So we're going to move on to hear a little bit more about the breeding side now. So I'd like to introduce my second speaker of the day, who is Stephen Schwarm. Thank you so much, Stephen, for joining us. Stephen is a corn breeder at Beck's Hybrids, and his breeding target is 108 to 115 day corn hybrids adapted to Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee. So he has a nice little reach on the country there. He began his career at Beck's Hybrids in 2017 as an assistant breeder before he moved into his current role in 2020. And he, not only that, but he studied soybean breeding and genetics at the University of Illinois and graduated with a PhD in crop sciences. So thank you so much, Stephen, for joining us. We are so excited to hear about your breeding endeavors, and I'll let you take it from here.
All right. Thank you very much, Alex. I'm glad to talk with you guys today. When I was approached by Alex and Seed World to talk with this webinar, they wanted a discussion on breeding strategies for abiotic stresses and drought. And I decided to take the tack of discussing more in general how I breed for yield stability, because by definition, yield stability, you have to be able to cope with a wide variety of stresses, including drought and changes in weather patterns. So as Alex said, I'm a breeder with Beck's Hybrids. And first, I'll give a little plug for the company. Beck started in 1937 and is the largest family-owned retail seed company in the U.S. We're headquartered in Atlanta, Indiana, which is where I work. And we offer products sourced from other companies and suppliers, and in addition to our own corn breeding program. And what this does is it provides a more diverse lineup for the customer and more choices for the farmers. So my role with the company with breeding is I'm the Eastern corn breeder. So my breeding targets, like she says, 108 to 115 day corn, adapted to Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, and a bit in Southern Illinois. So that circle on the map is my zone of adaptation I'm looking for. I started as Central Illinois assistant corn breeder before moving to the Eastern corn breeder. So my first experience here was with the flat, deep prairie soils, rich soils of Central Illinois before going into the forest soils and more marginal to moderate fertility soils. So I've seen a variety of growing conditions here. And one reason I'm talking to you guys today is because my current marketing territory right here is there's more stresses involved as far as soil types and conditions. So really stress breeding is more at the forefront of my target compared to some other areas. So some typical challenges that I deal with and that growers in my area deal with, field quality. Fertility is different here than when you look at prairie soils. So even though these are generally less productive fields, we do have plenty of high productivity soils, but typically we're looking at medium to low productivity. So hybrids that growers are going to be wanting are things that you're not necessarily looking at the racehorse, which you put lots of inputs on, get top end, break the grain bin yields. You're looking at more stable, consistent players here. Field uniformity, there's usually inconsistent soils within a field and terrain going across the field. So this is difficult for breeding because you're trying to find a consistent small footprint to look for. A little bit tougher than some other areas of the country. And farmers, they need a hybrid that will work across a variety of soil types and be able to work on the hilltops in addition to the lower areas. Drainage on fields can be a difficulty, especially getting into Ohio and eastern Indiana. Heavy clay soils will hold the water. This is where the farmer needs a hybrid that can germinate in saturated soils. We call that having good wet feet is important here. Management can be an issue. A lot of times these farmers have smaller economic margins, so there's less money to play with inputs. So sometimes they might cut back or reduce on inputs, such as maybe reducing weed control or having less application of nitrogen and other nutrients. And then just like any condition or any area across the country, weather seems like it never cooperates. So we either have too much rain at the wrong time, winds from heavy storms, or not enough rain and getting droughts. So those are all abiotic stresses that we deal with, just like anywhere else. So what's needed for the farmer in my territory? Workhorse hybrids, but with a punch. So these are hybrids that you can ensure are always going to give you a return. You're always going to make money on them. But when you give them the opportunity to perform, they will give you high yields. But if they're under stress, that basement, the low potential is higher than some other hybrids. So you want it to work in all different kinds of growing conditions. You want to protect the yield, so having yield protections with agronomics, such as strong roots and stalks, shorter plant height, and having a good disease package. And I attached two pictures here on the left. This is a hybrid that has good resistance to southern rust, so you have a lot of green leaves in the foliage still. And on the right, that's very susceptible to southern rust. So the one on the left is more adapted to handling the diseases that are common in Kentucky and Tennessee, southern Indiana. So that one you would expect to have better yield, is continuing to photosynthesize, whereas the other one does not have any photosynthetic potential anymore. Stand establishment is important. If you don't have the plants with uniform emergence and full emergence, then you're setting yourself up to not be able to succeed. Stress tolerance is critical as well. Like I said, hilltops, you're going to have less moisture there. A lot of these soils don't hold as much moisture or nutrients, so stress tolerance is important. And put that all together, yield stability is what these farmers are looking for. So for breeding, the way that I go after yield stability first is to test in a range of environments. So my testing zones are not only in high potential, we're also looking at medium potential soils, and late stage testing, we get into low potential as well. We're looking east and west, north and south. Even early hybrids are tested in Kentucky to be able to find hybrids that have the heat stress tolerance. And selecting hybrids and advancing hybrids is not solely based off of overall average yield. I'm also looking at consistency of performance. So even though on average it might win the trial, if it's not consistently in the top section of the trials, then maybe that one does not move forward as you would expect. So we're also evaluating and breeding forward for agronomic traits. So assessing per se and inbreds and hybrids for desired agronomic traits. And then once we find those, we're going to breed forward with those. So things that have great disease package or stay green plant height, we're going to orient our breeding around that to ensure that we're carrying that forward. And then lastly, pre-screening hybrids with predictions to evaluate stability and regionality. And I'll touch on that in a little more detail. So this comes into play here as we have changing climates. This was a graphic that I ran across several years ago that shows the expected weather patterns for, in this case, Illinois, how it should progress in mid-century, late century 2000s. And something that they pointed out was we should expect warmer and drier summers, which if you think of global warming, that's kind of what you think of at first, but that's not really the full picture. With climate change, we're also seeing earlier and heavier rains in the spring, and just in general, more extreme weather events that we're having to deal with. For example, I like to think of 2012 as being like the golden standard of a drought year. In key growing conditions in July, almost the entire country was in severe drought. But then you look at 2019, which had disastrous, consistent heavy rains in the spring, which delayed planting to late May or early June, which a lot of farmers had to take crop insurance out for not being able to get their fields in. So these are very different events, but both are very harmful for the overall crop. In 2020, Iowa had a derecho event that steamrolled a lot of the corn across the state, as shown in that picture there. So these are different kinds of weather events, not only drought, but storms and rains and just changing climate. So how does changing climate affect what we would do as breeding? Well, one thing is that farmers are starting to grow fuller season hybrids further north. So as the growing season lengthens, these farmers are going to take advantage of it. So something that may have only been targeted for southern Indiana may start being grown in central Indiana. So we're always adapting where we're testing things to reflect what's the common practice for our customers. Diseases evolve over time and with climate and other factors. For instance, we're starting to see tar spot, which is a new evolving disease. We don't know how that's going to play out economically. Is it going to be a big disease that we're going to have to breed for, or is it going to fizzle out? We won't know until in the future. Breeding wise, we're losing with heavy rains and storms and all of this, we lose more plots. So we have to deal and strategize with losing data and keeping our data quality up. Heavier rains means more nitrogen and nutrient loss. So this brings in, is important to side dress and have later season, more timely application of nutrients. Warmer winters may have a potential for more overwintering pests. And in total, I would say this stresses the importance of having stable hybrids in the future. So pre-screening hybrids with predictions. I wanted to talk a little bit more about this. So genomic prediction is the modern breeding. This is what we are currently doing. And we've had great success with our genomic prediction process. It's increased the efficiency of testing. We're only testing the very best instead of wasting plots on things that have no hope. And our quality of products that we're producing has taken a big step forward. And to do this, we're utilizing machine learning with a company called Computomics. And we've had great success with them. We're predicting millions of hybrid combinations, and we're only taking the very best that has the highest probability for success and testing that into the field. So we're increasing our genetic gain by using genomic prediction. We've found very strong accuracies of predicting performance of hybrids in specific environments in the past where we've had data collected. But what we're working on now is trying to expand that to predicting performance in new environments, because those past environments while you can still go to the same field, the weather is going to be different. You never have the exact same environment occur. So being able to predict into new environments becomes key. And our hope is to use this as a product placement tool for breeders. So we want to fine tune the environmental predictions, the G by E predictions, so that breeders can, at the earliest stage of testing, identify the hybrids that have the best probability of performing across environments, of being that stable performer, and be able to put our emphasis on those at the very beginning. We also want to target hybrids to where they're best adapted. So just because I develop an inbred for my program doesn't mean it's going to be best adapted to Indiana and Ohio. It may have a better fit in, say, Iowa. So if we can identify where to place inbreds and hybrids, then we can test them in their best environments. Prediction of hybrid performance is not what's been in the past, it's what it needs to be what's in the future. As Will said, as breeders, we need to think 10 years into the future, because it's going to take that long from when we develop something to when it can be marketed. So we are collecting massive amounts of data with drones, weather stations, soil probes, but the trick here is identifying what is actually the most key to doing the predictions and how to use that in a model. So this is something that we are working on. And we, as breeders, we also need to target traits that are important now, and with changing climates, how is that is it going to be more important, less important for our specific areas? So if we're dealing with heavier storms out west, they're probably going to be having a higher emphasis on reducing plant height. Heavier rains, strong emergence is key. More drought, earlier flowering time could be a higher importance. So those are just some traits that we're also looking at and thinking about how we can tweak those. So with that, that wraps up what I wanted to discuss with you. So Alex, I'll hand it back to you, and thank you very much.
No, thank you, Stephen. Now we're going to enter into a short Q&A time. So just a reminder, if you have any questions for either Will or Stephen, they're both going to be joining us live for this Q&A. So go ahead and start typing your questions into the chat box now. And in the meantime, I'll kick us off with some questions. So Will, in general, what do you see as the most striking thing when it comes to climate change?
That's a great question. You know, I actually think Stephen sort of touched on this as well with his Illinois example of it's not just, hotter and drier. It's the specific timing of events and whether those be extreme events or just sort of changing seasonal patterns. And it's so different across every geography and the impact that it has on every crop. But it's thinking about our, agronomic system as in a very fine balance, and just what a huge impact. Like, oh, the rain in this month is increasing. Everything else could stay the same, but that could still be a very devastating impact. So I think it's sort of just the specificity of the impacts that is it's important for us to understand, and can also be a bit scary.
Oh, perfect. Well said. And then Stephen, I'm going to steal a question that Will asked to all of us. I want to know, as a corn breeder, what is keeping you up at night when it comes to climate change? I know you talked about droughts, you talked about heavy rainfall, flooding, the derecos. What's concerning you most right now? Oh, I think you might be muted, Stephen. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Alex. I was, in fact, muted. So something that makes things difficult is that these events are not predictable and uniform. So 2012 was a drought across the Corn Belt, but Since then, for Indiana, I would say we haven't really had drought conditions. Iowa and Minnesota and Nebraska have been a bit droughty this year, but it's not, you can't always test in a consistent environment for something. But when those conditions arise, you want to be prepared to handle those. So trying to come up with a way to accurately and uniformly select for it is really difficult. Yeah, I would say just being able to orient your breeding program to be able to handle any kind of event that comes along is very difficult.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Will, I'm going to ask you a forward-looking question, which I know everyone just absolutely loves. So if you could look into your crystal ball, do you think we're going to end up seeing more extreme weather events, particularly in the U.S. in the future?
I can answer that definitively with a yes, I'm afraid, because just having looked at some of the data, with some of our customers operating in the U.S., as we do see these risks of extremes. I was just reviewing an analysis with a customer this morning on the U.S. Midwest and looking at the increase in extreme heat events, really not even heat events, extreme heat days during the summer months, and impacting the soybeans. And so yes, and I think it's also important to sort of think about, we talk about climate change. People often hear, oh, the world is getting warmer by 1 degree, 2 degrees. That's the average. And sometimes the averages in some places are rising much faster. But as the averages move, the chance of an extreme increases exponentially. So a 1 degree increase in the average temperature can mean a 2 times increase in the chances of an extreme heat wave. And so that's, I think, the thinking of, let's not look at just the average. It's let's, to the best of our ability, plan for some of these extremes.
And then, of course, Will, I'm going to ask you another follow-up question. Stephen mentioned, in addition to things like drought and flooding, we've been seeing things like derechoes, and even on some of the coasts that could potentially affect other regions, things like hurricanes, tornadoes, things like that. Do you think, in addition to these maybe higher temperatures, lower temperatures, things like that, that we'll see more storms and extreme weather disasters?
I'll answer that at a high level, but I won't speak too heavily just because I haven't looked at the data myself. I just know sort of in general, climate scientists have been very strong on the point of increased extreme weather. Like as ocean temperatures rise, that fuels stronger and more frequent storms. But I won't get more specific on where those impacts might be, just because I'm not directly familiar with it.
No, that's perfect. Thanks, Stephen. A high level is all we need sometimes to answer some questions. Stephen, I want to look into a little bit more about what you're focusing on right now. So you talked a little bit more about traits in particular that you're looking into, especially when it concerns climate. Like I think you mentioned, for example, earlier flowering for drought years and things like that. Mm-hmm. So what are you specifically working on right now, if you can share with us?
Yeah. So health packages is kind of a focus right now. Improving southern rust was really heavy this year from what I could see. And so just being able to have that yield protection for the farmers. And each area of my market has a different main disease that's most common there. So northern leaf blight in Ohio and northern Illinois or Indiana is really common. So I do have projects that are oriented towards improving health. Agronomics are always a key factor. So the silver lining of the rain clouds with storms and these weather events is that you get a chance to see the warts in hybrids. So when you have strong winds, you can find out what's got weak roots or weak stalks and what's going to break. And so you try to use, turn your lemons into lemonade and make selections that are going to move your program forward, even when it kind of damages your data. So, yeah. The predicting G by E is a very exciting opportunity for me. So there's a lot of work there too.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. My next question I want to open up to both of you. So I guess, Will, if you want to start, and then Stephen, you can add on your thoughts afterwards. We've been talking a lot about seed companies. Will, you brought up in your presentation one of your clients that's a seed company and how climate change is affecting them. But I want to ask you both, what have you been hearing in terms of our grower customers and what they think about climate change? Is it a concern to them, or is it something that they're just kind of year to year looking at, just wondering what's going to happen?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I think I'd be really curious to hear Stephen's perspective as well. What we often hear is it's less about sort of the longer term planning, type, what traits am I going to need 10 years from now? Because growers are thinking about how am I going to get yield this season. To the extent they're thinking about climate, it's about sort of some of the volatility that Stephen was talking about. So last year was a drought. Now I've got flooding. In the Midwest, you had both in the same year this year. So it's what am I in for? What's coming next? It's sort of this again. So at ClimateAi, we also have sort of and this is sort of talking about that Skip platform in Australia, and it's available worldwide. Is sort of forecasting what's the likelihood that this year will be drier, or that you'll have early rains or a heat event during flowering, so that maybe before you get seed in the ground, you sort of know what the right time to plant or what the right seed is to go for this year, given what you can expect from the coming season. So that's sort of how we think about helping growers navigate. It's really focused more on this season volatility.
Yeah, and Will, I would agree with that. And a lot of my observations are just anecdotal. I don't know for a fact, like the percentage feel this way or anything, but I would say a lot of farmers, they're very concerned about this year and the upcoming year, but they don't necessarily think like 10, 15 years in the future. Rightfully so. They need to think about the now. But I would say you can notice a trend. I always hear people talk about how, it doesn't snow as much as it did when I was a kid. So farmers do acknowledge that climate is different than what it was 15, 20 years ago. And like I had said, that farmers are growing fuller season hybrids. So they're noticing they've got more of a growing season. So they're going to take advantage of that. When they've got heavier rains in the spring, they're going to adapt and look for hybrids that are going to give them a better stand in wet conditions. So I would say maybe not necessarily looking 15 years in the future, but they're adapting to what they do see over time.
And I would just add one point that, I think, Stephen, you would agree. It's not that they don't want to think that far in the future. Right. But in some ways, that's kind of a luxury that unfortunately they don't have because they're facing the challenges today. It's why part of that reason that at ClimateAi, we don't actually sell directly to farmers. We sell to seed companies, for example, and then they can maybe sell our tools to farmers. But we really rely on those trusted advisors of farmers that can help them think through this year and maybe even sort of plan a little bit, the Stephens of the world, to help them prepare.
Yeah. And I'd say as a breeder, it's my responsibility to think 10, 15 years in the future so that they've got the products and the tools available to them to meet the demands that are going to be there at that time.
No, thank you. That is well said from both of you. I mean, that's why we as seed companies are here. We're here to help and to advise. So Stephen, I hope you were expecting this question based on what you said, because I need you to answer a forward-looking question for me now.
Okay.
As a professional breeder, what is your opinion on the kind of traits that you think we'll need in that 10 to 15 year timeline?
Yeah. Yield is always the first target that I look at as a breeder, to try to keep up with the checks that we have every year. So that's the bar that I'm always trying to push. But talking with customers directly, that's not always their first priority is the yield. Their first priority a lot of times is having that basement being raised to where they're not going to take a big loss if they have challenges that they experience, and having the agronomics so that when they have the opportunity to go harvest a field, it's not laying down on the ground. It's still intact and upright. So I'm always going to be trying to push the yield, but I'm going to be looking for those traits that are valued by the customer as well.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one more question that I'll direct to both of you. Any advice for seed companies as they approach climate change and extreme weather patterns? I guess I'll start again. Will, I'll have you start, and then Stephen, if there's anything else you want to add, please feel free to.
Okay.
I mean, I would just reiterate, the point of whatever your strategy is, I would strongly encourage to just start the process, if you haven't already, of coming up with one. There is, even though we often think of climate change in terms of longer term impacts, as you all as breeders know, the decisions we need to make to set ourselves up for future success have to happen today. And there is a lot of urgency around starting to get set up.
Yeah, and I agree with that. So if you have to be honest and open-minded about it, and if you see changes, then you need to adapt early, because breeding is a long-term process, and developing products takes a lot of time. So it takes time to make changes, so you have to do it early.
Awesome. And I don't even want to get into all the regulatory challenges that I'm sure come with breeding as well that make it a holdup. Well, thank you so much to both of you. I think that's all the time we had today for this. So one big thank you to our experts for joining us, not only to present, but for our Q&A. So thank you, Will. Thank you, Stephen, for joining. And a thank you to all of you who listened and participated. And we really hope you found this information of value. Again, if there was a section you had to miss because you stepped out of the room, or there was a session you just want to go back and rewatch, just know that within the next couple of days, we'll have a recording available at seedworld.com. And within the next month, we'll also have a Seed World strategy article for you to read, highlighting some of the events of today. So thank you so much again. And we hope you all have a fantastic day. Be sure to look out for our next strategy webinar, where we're going to start shifting our gear from corn to soybeans. So this has been Alex Martin of Seed World signing off. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.